Okay, moving on now. So from the post-colonial era to the pan-Arab movement, from the rise of religious fundamentalism and then to the Arab Spring in 2011, the Middle East has undergone radical changes over the past 5 years, reshaping local societies and also geopolitics at large. But what about how those transformations have affected individuals on the micro level? Well, Kamal Al-Solaylee's 2012 book, Intolerable, a Memoir of Extremes, intertwines his own personal journey of coming out as a gay man in the Middle East with more than 50 years of history offering a microcosm of life in the region. His book was just translated into French, so he joins me here in the studio in Paris for Perspective. Kamal Al-Solaylee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So can you tell us again about your book that was just published into French here? What brought about the desire to write this memoir?
I've always wanted to give a voice to the experience of being gay in the Middle East. I don't think it's a story that we hear a lot about. I've been very lucky in that I studied in England. I went to live, and then I'm Canadian. I went to live in Canada, and I've had the comfort and the luxury to be able to tell the story without fear of repercussions. And the intersection between sort of Arab and Muslim identity and gay identity is something I kind of always read. I wanted to explore, but I also didn't want to just write a book about myself, even though it's a memoir. I wanted to be a story of the last 50 years in the Middle East, particularly in relation to the places I grew up in, Yemen, Lebanon, and Egypt.
So you said that you have a certain degree of luxury and privilege to have studied in English-speaking countries, et cetera, but your family also, as you explained in your book, was kind of forced to leave several different countries amidst upheavals in the Middle East. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And has also suffered in Yemen more recently.
Absolutely. I mean, we were the sort of the classic baby boomer family. I'm the youngest of 11 children. They were all born between 1946 and I'm born in 64. And we've had we grew up in Yemen, in Aden, which was then a British protectorate, and we had sort of all the privilege of that society. And then when the socialist revolution came up in 1967, we were exiled and we went to live in Beirut for a few years. In Beirut, then soon after, there were some ethnic tensions and violence that eventually erupted into a 15-year civil war. And then we went to live in Cairo, Egypt, which was a very safe and comfortable place as children. But it soon sort of fell to the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and a kind of a very hardline form of Islam. And also the gap between the rich and the poor became wider and wider, which led to a number of social problems. Eventually, the family decided to go back and live in Yemen, our ancestral homeland, in Sana'a in particular. And I just did not feel that it would be the right thing or a safe thing for me. So as you said, like as I had the privilege to go and study in England and then in Canada and sort of make a life for myself, I witnessed the changes in my family's life at the same time.
Your book is called, again, Intolerable, Memoir of Extremes. Can you talk about some of the extremes that you're referencing in the title?
I'm talking about the fact that I live freely in Canada. I'm gainfully employed. I have access to health care. I have access to 4 shots of the coronavirus vaccine, for example. In the last year, I've lost 2 sisters to COVID, for example, because vaccine equity or inequity is quite pronounced in a place like Yemen. And in general, the extreme has something to do with the fact that I am free to live my life the way I wanted and away from the influence or the pressure of religion in general, which is not always the case for people living in the region. But you know, by far it is an economic disparity between my life and theirs.
How do you define the relationship between your own personal story, especially coming out as a gay man in the Middle East, and some of the major political upheavals that we've seen in the region over the decades and as you moved from place to place?
Well, I think there is a connection there because in many ways there's an influence of Western culture that was quite heavy, pronounced in the Middle East. So I was exposed to what it feels like to be a free and emancipated gay man. And then there is that backlash to that culture that happened, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, as a more politicized form of Islam started to take over a number of Arab countries. So in that sense, the kind of the conflict between my inner life as a gay man and the outer politics of the region was much more visible. It was a case of a clash between two lives, two choices of life that weren't compatible. For people from my generation, I chose to leave the Middle East behind and go to the West and find myself in the West. But as I write in the book, I mean, the Middle East has a way of following you wherever you go. So it tracks you down, and obviously, my blood relation to my family is very strong, and I feel very compelled to, not necessarily, it's in some part in the French edition because I've added new sections, postscript to it, but generally in my journalism as a writer, to speak on behalf of the people of Yemen, the humanitarian disaster, the food insecurity, the ongoing war that's been going on now for 7 to 8 years.
I know the kind of extent, the scale of the changes is perhaps not comparable, but do you ever fear, given what we've seen in the United States, even in Western Europe over the past several years, that there might be a return to similarly kind of reactionary outbursts against minorities, gays, or women, even in the West now, where you've been so free over the past several decades?
It's funny you should say that, because my most recent book in English is called Return, Where We Go Back to Where We Come From, and it's about me starting to feel that the last 10 years have taken a toll on personal freedom. I kind of a return to what I would comfortably say fascist politics in a number of Western countries, and that always puts minorities at risk. But the point in this book is that one should always be vigilant about rights. I mean, rights can be given, but rights can be taken as well. So yeah, and the story of the Middle East is a story of rights being slowly eroded over the years.
Kamal Al-Solaylee, that's unfortunately all we have time for. Thank you so much for
My
coming
pleasure.
on the show today. And as a reminder to our viewers, his memoirs, Intolerable, Memoirs of the Extremes, is available now in French and English as well.